which lies beyond civilization. Weird. The weird and the eerie.
Tales from the crypt.
Hello, guys and ghouls. This is Marlowe and Steven.
Yes, we are back, and this is Lost Futures, extra creepy third season to ring in the creepy fall season of
Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast, and we are covering The Weird and the Eerie by
The Weird
Mark
and the
Fisher.
Eerie. Yes, we're back. We did Ghosts of My Life in season 1,
His second most famous book.
and then Capitalist Realism in season 2,
His first most famous book.
and now we're doing his least...
Third most famous, I think.
Yeah.
Solidly third most famous book.
The Weird and the Eerie, which was released in 2016. It's a weird and eerie book because it was released
Posthumous.
posthumously or close to posthumously.
Yep.
And so it really coincided with his death, which is unfortunate, but it's still a great book, so we're still going to cover it. And that gets us into the beginning of the introduction, which is probably the most famous part of this book, or one of the most famous parts of this book.
I mean, it's an introduction that lays out the thesis of the book and what the book's about, which is what a good introduction should do. And effectively, it defines what he is using for the terms weird and eerie.
Yep. So throughout this chapter, we're going to investigate on what Mark Fisher wants to define the weird and what he wants to define the eerie and what, importantly, it isn't. Let's get into it. First paragraph. It is odd that it has taken me so long to really reckon with the weird and the eerie. For although the immediate origins of this book lay in fairly recent events, I have been fascinated and haunted by examples of the weird and the eerie for as long as I can remember. Yet I had not really identified the two modes, still less specified their defining features. No doubt, this is partly because the major cultural examples of the weird and the eerie are to be found at the edges of genres such as horror and science fiction, and these genre associations have obscured what is specific to the weird and the eerie.
I like that he probably first wrote, "It is weird that it's taken me so long to deal with the weird and the eerie," and then he's like, wait, no, I can't say that. And then he needed to come up with the word odd.
He went into his thesaurus and was like...
Yeah. Mark has always been a little gothy boy, and he's finally writing about his favorite modes.
Spooky stuff.
Yeah. So... First and foremost, he uses this term modes to define the weird and the eerie, and then, as we will briefly get into, the uncanny or Unheimlich.
Right. The full name of this introduction is called The Weird and the Eerie, in parentheses, Beyond the Unheimlich.
Yes. And he mentions this again later on, that these are quote-unquote not genres but modes, so... I mean, I'm going with the idea of like a tonal set of aesthetics that doesn't quite encompass a genre but can be found in several genres. But it is generally, as he says, identified with horror and science fiction.
Horror and science fiction, and he gets into it a little bit later at the end of this, but it kind of revolves around modernity or coming to terms with the effects of modernity, and he's interested as to why these two genres...
Modes.
Well, the genres of horror and science fiction came up and became popular in the advent of modernity. And then, within those two genres, these modes evolved, I think, would be the best.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly good working idea for now. I mean, he immediately identifies Freud's concept of the Unheimlich, which is generally translated to as uncanny in English, although there is some famous German ambiguity there. But essentially, the idea being that the Freud essay kind of was seen as the background defining feature of the study of these genres of science fiction and horror, and he is kind of trying to introduce an ancillary or additional set of ways of thinking about these genres.
Yeah, he says that there's a spell that's been cast by Freud's concept of the Unheimlich, which has delayed him coming round to the weird and the eerie. So,
Right.
because Freud is so prevalent in the study of these genres, or the literary theory behind these genres, he feels like, yeah, it made it difficult for him to really reckon with these modes.
Right. So we did both actually read the Freud essay.
The Freud essay is the uncanny, or the Unheimlich.
Yes.
And what'd you think of the essay?
I mean, I would say in terms of its definition of what uncanny means, both through the essay and through Fisher's use of the essay, it, I believe, is a fairly familiar, almost, general definition. It's not a super technical. It's kind of what you think uncanny means. As far as the more psychoanalytic attempts, the reduction of it as being a displaced castration anxiety, I'm not sure I agree with it. I don't know. I haven't read a lot of Freud. I read through the essay. I think it's fine.
So, yeah, he says that Canny, this essay in 1919, it follows a study of E. Jansch, which is another psychoanalysis who also wrote about the Unheimlich, and how it arouses dread and creeping horror. And so for Freud, this is very interesting, because why would someone be attracted to witnessing something that gives them what we associate with a negative, or why would you want to experience that? And he then goes into this kind of linguistic analysis of Heimlich, which means friendly, close, congenial, familiar, or homely is the, I think, literal definition, because Heim is home. And then Unheimlich is not as easy to define because it means literally unhomely.
Right.
And at the time it was associated with animate objects like wax figures, dolls, and with lifelike eyes. So you can already see where Freud is saying there's this creepiness and dread, and this is where he kind of interjects his hypothesis that it's castration anxiety that drives us to desire experiencing this.
But actually, I do need to just point out the funniest goddamn paragraph of that essay, which is where he identifies that many men find the female genitalia to be uncanny, which he thinks is interesting because what is the vagina if not a passageway to the original home of man?
That's what he's...
Yeah, no, that's totally that was like my favorite goddamn part of this goddamn essay. It's like right before part 2, maybe?
To conclude this collection of examples, which is certainly not complete, I will relate an instance taken from psychoanalytical experience. If it does not rest upon mere coincidence, it furnishes a beautiful confirmation of our theory of the uncanny. It often happens that male patients declare that they feel there is something uncanny about the female genital organs. This Unheimlich place, however, is the entrance to the former Heim, home of all human beings, to the place where everyone dwelt once upon a time and in the beginning. There is a humorous saying, love is homesickness, and whenever a man dreams of a place or a country and says to himself, still in the dream, this place is familiar to me. I have been there before. we may interpret this place as being his mother's genitals or her body. Ugh. In this case, too, the Unheimlich is what was once Heimisch, home-like, familiar. The prefix un is the token of repression.
So, in addition to being why we pay Freud the big bucks for these takes, I think that this actually gets to my original point where if you want to just say what is Freud's, like, definition of the uncanny, and that it is a close to what I would consider a casual definition, as you said, wax figures, eyes, etc. It is that almost, if you heard of the term uncanny valley, usually related to CGI movies and video games, that kind of creepy familiarity where something appears familiar, appears almost home-like. It's not exactly a negation of the home-likeness. It appears very familiar, but there's just something off about it enough that makes it feel creepy. And this is also something that Fisher identifies with, that is his point of departure from Unheimlich.
My name is Sigmund Freud. I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges, and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis.
So, yeah, like I said, I do feel like there's something perhaps weird or uncanny about the notion of, oh yeah, Freud was alive long enough for us to have video and voice recordings of him. It's kind of something you forget, at least for me.
So to go back to your point that you made before our break, Freud comes up with the Unheimlich, or he doesn't come up with it, he theorizes about it, yes, and attributes it throughout the essay to a lot of fiction and movies and things at the time that he, specifically fiction, but also apparently female genitals and
yeah, this fixation on like creepy human faces, also vaginas, also
eyes,
creepy eyes and vaginas.
Sandman and like the dreams of
Sandman, which is like this rather complicated sounding story in Germany that does not appear to be at all related to...
Well, okay, so here is my little synopsis of the Sandman. The Sandman that haunts a child, uncertainty about what is real and what is dream, non-reality or madness, and that's like what he's interested about, that fictional story.
Yeah, it's this odd story about this adult who, as a child, was told this story about a Sandman who punishes children for staying up too late, and then he has these fragmentary memories about the Sandman related to the trauma of his father's death, and then, like, as an adult, he kind of discovers things that perhaps these aren't just fragmentary memories, perhaps these are, you know, actual things that happened, and it's this place of being unaware of what's real and what's not real and stuff like that, I think is fair.
And Fisher is saying that the weird and the eerie is related to it, but not like the uncanny or the Unheimlich. And how is it? He goes into great detail as to why the weird and the eerie are not like this. Here he says, there's certainly something that the weird, and the eerie, and the Unheimlich share. They are all affects, but they are also modes. Here again he says modes. Modes of film and fiction, modes of perception. Ultimately, you might even say modes of being. Even so, they are not quite genres. Perhaps the most important difference between the Unheimlich on the one hand and the weird and the eerie on the other is their treatment of the strange. Freud's Unheimlich is about the strange within the familiar. The the strangely familiar, the familiar as strange, about the way in which the domestic world does not coincide with itself. All of the ambivalences of Freud's psychoanalysis are caught up in this concept. Is it about making the familiar and the familial strange, or is it about returning the strange to the familial? Here we can appreciate the double move inherent to Freudian psychoanalysis. First of all, there is estrangement of many of the common notions about the family, but this is accompanied by a compensatory move whereby the outside becomes legible in terms of a modernist family drama. And so he then says that psychoanalysis is itself an Unheimlich genre, haunted by the outside, which it circles around, but it can never fully acknowledge or affirm. And so he's saying that the Unheimlich starts from within what is already known and familiar.
Yeah. It almost kind of reminds me of I think of them as Zizek ideas, but they're probably just psychoanalyst ideas of, Freud's like treatment of the dream as like the thing you see is both hiding the truth, but also itself the truth. And that notion of this is not my mother, this is a simulation replaced by aliens. This is, like that kind of classic psychotic break.
And so then how does Mark Fisher distinguish Weird and the Eerie from it?
So both Weird and Eerie, he believes, focus on outsideness and the unfamiliar rather than the familiar in slightly different ways, I think, is a quick summary.
He says that it's symptomatic of a secular retreat from the outside. The wider predilection for the Unheimlich is commensurate with a compulsion towards a certain kind of critique which operates by always processing the outside through the gaps and impasses of the inside. The Weird and the Eerie make the opposite move. They allow us to see the inside from the perspective of the outside. Mm-hmm. And here, I think, is probably the most succinct he gets with defining what weird is.
Yes.
The weird is that which does not belong. So, what does that mean? In a later chapter, he says it's a third eye appearing in somebody's head.
That's the next episode, we'll say. It's Cthulhu.
It's
the bizarre, the alien, the completely, we don't have language to even describe this because it's so externalized. But it's here, and now it's within our realm of reality, but it's something that doesn't belong.
Right. He says the weird brings to the familiar something which ordinarily lies beyond it, and which cannot be reconciled with the homely, even as its negation. The form that is perhaps most appropriate to the weird is montage, the conjoining of two or more things which do not belong together. So, yeah, I think of like Frankensteining things together.
Yeah.
When you have like different pieces of body parts put together into one body part, I think of that as sort of a weird mode.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the montage example that this makes me think of is the Godfather baptism montage, where on the one hand you have this priest talking in church, do you reject Satan? Do you promise to uphold the Christian faith? Do you promise to honor Jesus Christ? Michael Corleone says, I do, I do, I do. And after each question, there is a shot of someone getting murdered on Michael Corleone's orders. So it's this very famous, it's even referenced in a Run the Jewels song. Like the scene in Godfather 1, you get the gun while I christen my son.
Michael Francis Rizzi, do you renounce Satan?
I do renounce him.
And all his works? comes,
I do renounce them.
Yeah. So, yes, pre-Vatican II was very verbose. But,
It's not exactly what I associate with the weird, but
yeah, I wouldn't say it's the weird. I would say it's the montage example he's kind of giving to highlight an idea about the weird, but it's just what made me think of it as stitching together two kind of disparate things.
I think he's sort of getting to more of like the surrealism aspect of early art and trying to make, which I think this type of montage is definitely signaling to like a form of modernity, but
I was just saying, like, in terms of a stitched together montage of disparate things next to each other. But
here he gets into Jacques Lacan, and this is the first mention of Lacan, hence also the reason that Jacques Lacan, rising to the challenge posed by surrealism and the rest of aesthetic modernism, could move towards a weird psychoanalysis in which the death drive, dreams, and the unconscious become untethered from any naturalization or sense of homeliness.
mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the end of the weird portion of this essay.
So I think to summarize, the weird is the external brought internal.
Yes.
Not the Unheimlich, which is sort of the externality kind of almost sublated within the internality, I think might be a way to think about it. And then we're going to talk about what the Eerie is.
Right.
And wish I was special. You're so very special. And I'm a creep. I'm a widow.
Alright, now we're done with the weird and we're entering into the eerie. And what is the eerie? He starts this out saying that the eerie, at first glance, might be seen as closer to the Unheimlich, but much like the weird, the eerie has to do with the outside, which is what he pre-established the weird was also doing, and here he's saying the eerie also does that. But what's the difference between weird and eerie then? Well, as we established before, the weird is that which does not belong. And I think an accurate definition of the eerie, at least the way he's using it here, is when something is supposed to be there, but it's absent.
Yes. So
The absence of something that's supposed to be there.
right. And I mean, you can see how that's perhaps closer to the Unheimlich if we're going by the, wax doll analogy, for example, because a wax doll looks human, but it, lacks consciousness, it lacks a soul, it lacks the, precise proportions that make us human. So, this is sort of going with that, but it's more focused on that absence rather than the familiar.
Yeah, the eerie has more to do with, as he says, landscapes, partially emptied by humans, has to do fundamentally with agency, which is what I think you're sort of positing, like that it's focused more on the lack of agency that a doll has than just the appearance of it. And that lack of agency comes up especially when we describe an eerie cry. He uses an eerie cry where we don't know where the cry is coming from, and that lack of known agency
Or known agent.
Yeah.
Yeah, if anything, it's more about having an agency without an agent.
Right.
So, for example, I would say, if a wax doll is Unheimlich or uncanny, then perhaps a human statue on Mars would be eerie.
Yeah.
You know, because the question arisen by a wax doll, for example, would be, did that wax doll move? Is that wax doll looking at me? That wax doll's creepy as shit. The question about a human statue on Mars is, who built that statue? That statue implies an agency. Someone carved that out, but there's no agent because it's Mars.
Right. That is a pretty perfect example, and he makes this even more political in this section where he says that capital, within capitalist society, capital itself is at every level an eerie entity. Conjured out of nothing, capital nevertheless exerts more influence than any allegedly substantial entity.
Yeah, and I mean, going off that, not something he said, but the old adage that, you know, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. I mean, that sort of conspiratorialism often is trying to assign an agent to capital's agency. Because it is strange that things seem to be systematically designed to personally fuck you, as if someone out there hates you and is trying to fuck you. But in fact, that's literally just an autonomous system that appears to hate you.
Yeah. And there's the other old adage, the description of the invisible hand of the market. I think of that.
Yeah.
And another assignment of agency without an agent.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you have the metaphorical agent, this invisible hand, or you have this
conspiratorial
posited
agent.
Theoretical agent of this, you know, cabal of whoever people, you know, I'm not going to say the religion, but you know the religion. But, you know, it's that either we're describing capitalism as capitalist and we acknowledge there's no agent, but even then we make up a metaphor for an agent, or we don't understand capitalism and we think there's an agent because there must be. Or we're good Marxists and we understand all this perfectly. But yeah, and another example going off his idea of partially emptied spaces, I often think of the post-apocalyptic scenery, the zombie movie. You know, the scene from 28 Days Later, he wakes up in this empty hospital room, walks outside to these empty streets of London, and that being eerie because London implies people, but there are no people. Yeah,
I love that scene because it has, you know, Godspeed You Black Emperor's soundtrack to it, which is already a very eerie sounding music. Post-rock is very eerie as a genre because there you mostly have vocalless music that sets a soundscape, and even when there is a vocalist, it's oftentimes one that evokes eeriness to it. And in that scene, there's this uncanniness to even the way it looks on the screen, which keeps it otherworldly.
It's almost like a, you know, Campbellian archetypal scene for the zombie movie genre, but I just do think of that one as probably one of the best examples of it. They should have paid for more Montreal breakfasts than the entire maple syrup industry.
Or at least like petit bourgeois music venues that they all own now. Alright, so we're getting to the end of this essay. He says here there's a metaphysical scandal, which we sort of went over, the immaterial and inanimate, and then he names drops two people that we're going to get into later, Nigel Neal and Alan Gardner. Nigel Neal being the director of Quatermass, and Alan Gardner being a sci-fi writer.
Okay.
So look for those in the future. And yeah, there's a way in which we ourselves are wrapped up in the pulsions of capital. Mm-hmm. And that we are always experiencing this eeriness and interacting with it on a daily basis, even in the most banal things, like he mentions the mirror cracking. He gets a little poetic here. There is no inside except as a folding of the outside. The mirror cracks. I am an other, and I always was. The shudder here is the shudder of the Eerie, not of the Unheimlich.
Yeah. Also, the Quatermass is eerie because there should be a second R in it, but there's not.
Yeah, so look for an episode of that in a little bit. He gets to this extraordinary example of what he calls the displacement of the Unheimlich by D.M. Thomas's novel The White Hotel, which is a book in 3 parts, and apparently they've tried to make it into a movie multiple times by people like David Lynch and others, but it never came to pass.
Yeah, David Lynch never did a Holocaust movie, I guess. You'd think he would have one.
Yeah, it says here it's been described as unfilmable or unadaptable. These include attempts by Bernardo Bertolucci with Barbra Streisand, by David Lynch with Isabella Rossellini.
She's the model from Blue Velvet, right? I think she's the damsel in distress from Blue Velvet.
Yeah, that's her, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And it never worked out. There was a...
Yeah, anyway, if we want to real quick, I mean, it sounds annoying to try and film. Sounds slightly annoying to try and read, but it's an interesting idea of this sort of time loop leading to the fucking Holocaust, where someone's getting psychoanalyzed by Freud about these distressing memories, but the memories are in fact a premonition of this person's own death in the Bobby Yar massacre.
Yeah, she has chronic psychosomatic pains in her left breast and ovary, and Freud tries to identify them, or something that would explain it, and so she writes this long poem, an erotic poem called Don Giovanni, and the Freud character in the book takes that poem and is like reading it over, and he's like, well, it wasn't something in your past, it must be something from your future.
Yeah, sure. Was this based on like an actual case study of Freud's, or is that a?
It's a fictionalization of, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, was like Anna K or whatever the fuck her name is?
I don't think
like,
so.
Okay. I was just wondering if it was like this is a fiction written by about a famous, like a fictionalized idea behind a famous.
In the book, she's revealed to be Elizabeth Erdmann of Vienna. Who has a pursues a moderately successful music career and marries a Russian Jewish opera singer, and then moves to Kiev in 1920, and then fast forwards again after he disappears in a communist purge. She falls on hard times and is massacred in the Baba Yar massacre.
Yep, my family moved the fuck away from Kiev in 1905. The best time to have done that.
Marlowe's great-grandfather was also a Freudian subject, and then he was like, I need to get out of here.
Yeah, no, he's like, yeah, this isn't getting better.
Yeah, he mentions that the problem of foresight and fate is something that is both weird and eerie. The weird sisters are the ones that produce fate, or they're the harbingers of the future and warning people about their future. He says here, the concept of fate is weird in that it implies twisted forms of time and causality that are alien to ordinary perception. But it is also eerie in that it raises questions about agency.
Yes.
Who or what is the entity that has woven fate?
Yep. Yeah. So next week we're dealing with fucking Lovecraft, so we're getting right into it. It's gonna be a fun goddamn season. We read like a bunch of Lovecraft. We've read some Philip K. Dick. Read a bunch of stuff. It'll be a fun ass time.
Yep. So to finish this up, in the last couple paragraphs, he says that modernist and experimental work often strikes us as weird when we first encounter it. The sense of wrongness associated with the weird, the conviction that this does not belong, is often a sign that we are in the presence of the new. And here I'm reminded once again of like the links to hauntology and his desire for something new to emerge out of the old and our struggle towards it. And also in capitalist realism, where he wants a new political order to displace capitalist realism. And here, once again, we see him saying that these modes point to something new coming about when everything is stagnant or everything is dreary and everything is depressing. Here we can look to these things and kind of give us something out of the ordinary of our reality in order to provoke newness, which I think is a constant theme within Fisher. His frustration that there seems to be nothing new, and him developing philosophy and art and literature which he hopes to bring about a new world.
Yeah. Yeah. It is probably his, I'd say, most subtly political book. Certainly out of the other two that we covered.
Yeah. All right. So see you next week. We're covering Lovecraft.
Yep.